The Cleveland Browns may have stumbled into a situation that nobody inside the organization expected to become this complicated this quickly. Just a few months ago, the quarterback discussion seemed almost settled. Most analysts believed the hierarchy was already established. Reporters covering the team repeatedly pointed toward the veteran presence in the room, and many fans assumed that Shedeur Sanders would spend much of his rookie season developing behind more experienced players. The expectation was simple: learn the system, adjust to the speed of the professional game, and wait for an opportunity somewhere down the road. But as organized team activities unfolded and more eyes focused on what was actually happening on the practice field, a very different story began to emerge. What was supposed to be a routine developmental period suddenly turned into one of the most talked about quarterback battles in football. And now, even some of the people who were most skeptical are being forced to reconsider what they are seeing. The reason this story has exploded isn't because of one flashy social media clip or a single lucky throw during practice. It's because the same observations keep appearing from different people watching the same player. Coaches may not be revealing much publicly, but reporters, analysts, former players, and insiders have all started highlighting similar qualities. They talk about the ball placement, they talk about the timing, they talk about the calmness under pressure. Most importantly, they talk about consistency. In the NFL, one great throw can grab headlines for a day. Repeating those throws over and over again is what changes opinions. And according to multiple observers following the Browns throughout the offseason, that repetition is exactly what has been taking place. Every practice seems to add another piece to the growing belief that Sanders might be further along in his development than many expected. What makes the situation even more fascinating is that the conversation extends far beyond raw statistics. Numbers matter, of course, and there are plenty of people pointing to completion percentages, touchdown totals, and practice performance metrics. But the biggest supporters of Sanders keep returning to something less tangible. They describe an energy that follows him wherever he goes. They point to how teammates respond when he steps into the huddle. They mention the confidence he appears to generate among players around him. These aren't qualities that show up neatly on a stat sheet, yet organizations spend years searching for quarterbacks capable of creating exactly that kind of environment. Whether those observations ultimately translate into long-term success remains to be seen. But the fact that so many people are bringing up the same traits has only intensified the discussion surrounding his future. At the center of all this attention is a growing question that becomes harder to ignore with every passing week. What if the teams that passed on Shedeur Sanders during the draft got it wrong? That's the question being whispered more frequently across football circles. It's the question appearing in fan discussions, sports talk shows, and online debates. Every strong practice performance adds fuel to that conversation. Every impressive throw creates another round of second-guessing. Every positive report coming out of Cleveland makes people wonder whether one of the most scrutinized prospects in recent memory is beginning to validate the belief that some supporters had in him all along. While it is still far too early to make definitive conclusions, the momentum surrounding Sanders is becoming impossible to dismiss. And perhaps the most surprising development of all is that some of the individuals who once appeared firmly committed to other narratives are now acknowledging the possibility that things may not be as settled as they originally believed. Comments that once sounded certain have become more cautious. Assumptions that once felt locked in now come with caveats. The quarterback competition that many expected to be straightforward suddenly looks anything but simple. Behind the scenes, a growing number of people are paying close attention to every practice, every drill, and every opportunity Sanders receives because they understand that something potentially significant may be unfolding. The Browns may have entered the offseason believing they knew exactly how this story would play out, but if recent developments are any indication, the ending may look very different than anyone originally imagined. And the moment that truly changed everything traces back to one throw that continues to follow Sanders wherever his story is discussed.
Long before the recent buzz surrounding Browns practices, before reporters began debating his place in the quarterback competition, and before fans started questioning whether Cleveland might have found something special, there was one play that refused to disappear. It wasn't a routine completion. It wasn't a short throw padded by yards after the catch. It was the kind of play that instantly forces people to stop what they're doing and watch the replay again. Week 12, against the Raiders, the Browns were struggling through a disappointing season. Confidence around the organization was low, and few people expected a rookie quarterback making one of his earliest professional starts to deliver a moment that would still be generating discussion months later. Then, the pressure arrived. A Raiders defender broke through on a crucial 3rd and 8 situation. The pocket collapsed. For many young quarterbacks, that sequence ends with a sack, a rushed mistake, or a desperate throw into traffic. Instead, Sanders stayed composed, slipped away from the pressure, reset himself, and launched a strike that traveled more than 50 yards downfield before finding its target. In a single moment, what looked like a broken play turned into one of the most memorable completions of the Browns season. What made the throw so remarkable wasn't simply the distance. NFL quarterbacks complete deep passes every week. What caught the attention of scouts, analysts, and coaches was everything that happened before the football left his hand. Sanders had to recognize the pressure. He had to avoid it without panicking. He had to keep his eyes downfield while defenders closed in around him. Then he had to deliver the football with enough precision to allow the play to succeed despite the chaos unfolding around him. Those are the details evaluators obsess over because they reveal qualities that statistics alone cannot measure. Arm strength can be taught and improved, physical tools can be developed, but poise under pressure is far more difficult to find. When observers revisited that Raiders play, many came away believing they were seeing evidence of a quarterback capable of remaining calm when everything around him was falling apart. The significance of the throw grew even larger once the numbers were examined. At the time, it stood as the longest passing play produced by the Browns offense that season. Think about that for a moment. Throughout an entire NFL season, featuring multiple quarterbacks, veteran players, and countless offensive snaps, one of the biggest passing moments belonged to a young quarterback making only the earliest starts of his professional career. That fact alone caused people to revisit the play repeatedly. The more they watched it, the more they focused on the ball placement. The pass wasn't simply completed, it arrived exactly where it needed to be. Defenders had little chance to make a play on it, while the receiver had every opportunity to finish the catch. In the NFL, where fractions of a second and inches of separation often determine outcomes, that level of placement can be the difference between a highlight and a turnover. As the offseason arrived and Browns practices opened to media observation, something interesting began happening. Reporters who had watched the Raiders throw months earlier started seeing flashes of the same thing during organized team activities. The description sounded familiar: tight windows, precise placement, throws arriving just beyond a defender's reach, passes delivered exactly where only the receiver could make a play. Suddenly, that famous completion against Las Vegas no longer looked like an isolated moment. Instead, it began to resemble a preview of something much bigger. Analysts who once viewed the throw as an impressive highlight started asking whether it actually revealed Sanders' greatest strength as a quarterback. The conversation shifted from discussing a single play to discussing a pattern. Several observers began using the same word repeatedly: accuracy. Not average accuracy, not good accuracy, elite accuracy. They pointed to how consistently Sanders appeared capable of fitting the football into difficult passing lanes. They highlighted his ability to throw receivers open before defenders could react. They noted that his ball placement often seemed to remove risk from otherwise dangerous situations. Those are the details evaluators obsess over because they reveal qualities that statistics alone cannot measure. Arm strength can be taught and improved, physical tools can be developed, but poise under pressure is far more difficult to find. When observers revisited that Raiders play, many came away believing they were seeing evidence of a quarterback capable of remaining calm when everything around him was falling apart. Perhaps the most important aspect of the play is what it represented psychologically. Quarterbacks are often judged by how they respond when things go wrong. Anyone can operate comfortably from a clean pocket with perfect protection. The real test comes when defenses force adjustments and chaos takes over. On that 3rd and 8 snap, everything initially broke down. Yet, instead of allowing the moment to overwhelm him, Sanders created an opportunity out of a potential disaster. Those are the types of moments coaches remember. Those are the types of plays teammates rally around. And those are the moments that can quietly alter perceptions inside an organization. One throw cannot win a starting job, but one throw can plant a seed. It can create curiosity. It can force decision-makers to ask questions they weren't asking before.
And as impressive as that throw looked in a live game, what happened during the Browns' offseason workouts would make many people wonder if it was only the beginning of a much larger story. If the throw against the Raiders planted the seed, organized team activities are what turned that seed into a full-blown conversation. Because once media members were allowed to observe portions of practice, a surprising pattern began to emerge. Instead of hearing isolated praise from a single reporter or one enthusiastic analyst, fans started seeing multiple observers describe nearly the same thing. The language varied, but the message remained consistent. Shedeur Sanders was making throws that demanded attention, not because they were flashy for social media, but because they displayed the kind of precision that coaches spend years trying to develop in young quarterbacks. Every practice seemed to generate another report about a pass perfectly placed between defenders, another example of timing that arrived exactly when it needed to, or another throw that left observers shaking their heads. Slowly but surely, the narrative surrounding the quarterback room began shifting. One particular sequence generated enormous discussion. During a competitive drill, Sanders delivered a pass that reportedly traveled past a defender's outstretched arm and arrived directly where the receiver could make a play. At first glance, that may not sound extraordinary. NFL practices are filled with completions every day. But what made this throw different was the reaction it received from people watching it in real time. Observers described it as a dart, others called it a laser, some simply referred to it as a bullseye. Regardless of the wording, the underlying point was the same. The football went exactly where it was supposed to go. For quarterbacks competing for roster positions and playing time, that level of accuracy matters because NFL defenses punish even the smallest mistakes. A pass that arrives 6 inches off target can become an incompletion. A pass that arrives a second late can become an interception. Sanders was earning praise because many of his throws seemed to eliminate those risks before they could develop. What really caught attention, however, was how frequently these moments appeared. One impressive throw can be explained away, 2 or 3 can be dismissed as a hot streak, but when similar reports continue surfacing throughout multiple practices, people begin looking for deeper explanations. Analysts covering the Browns started revisiting the strengths that made Sanders such a fascinating prospect coming out of college. Accuracy was always part of the scouting report. Anticipation was always there. The ability to process quickly and make difficult throws had been discussed before. The difference now was that those traits were appearing against NFL competition in an NFL environment. For supporters of Sanders, OTA footage felt less like a surprise and more like confirmation. For skeptics, it became increasingly difficult to argue that the positive reports were merely hype. The reactions from respected observers added even more fuel to the discussion. When respected football analysts repeatedly highlight the same characteristic, fans tend to listen. Several commentators began focusing specifically on Sanders' ball placement. They weren't simply talking about completed passes, they were talking about where those passes were being delivered. There is a significant difference. Quarterbacks can complete passes through scheme advantages, blown coverages, or receiver talent. Ball placement is different because it belongs almost entirely to the quarterback. It reflects decision-making, mechanics, timing, and accuracy, all working together in perfect synchronization. The more reporters discussed Sanders, the more this particular strength became the center of attention. Suddenly, conversations about the Browns' quarterback competition were no longer solely centered on experience or depth chart positioning. They were increasingly focused on performance. Another factor that changed the conversation was visibility. In previous months, opinions about Sanders were often based on projections. Analysts debated what he might become. Critics questioned whether his college success would translate. Supporters argued that his skills were being underestimated. But OTA practices gave observers something far more powerful than speculation.
They provided evidence. Fans could see clips circulating online, reporters could describe specific throws, analysts could point to actual practice performances rather than hypothetical scenarios. The discussion moved from theory to observation, and once that happened, momentum started building quickly. Every new highlight seemed to reinforce the growing perception that Sanders was not merely participating in the competition, he was actively forcing people to take him seriously. Perhaps the most fascinating development was how quickly the atmosphere around the quarterback battle appeared to change. Early expectations suggested Sanders would spend much of his time learning and developing behind more established names. Yet as practices continued, more questions emerged about whether that timeline might accelerate. Nobody inside the organization was making bold public declarations. Coaches remained measured. Teammates avoided controversy. But outside observers increasingly found themselves discussing possibilities that seemed unlikely weeks earlier. Could Sanders climb the depth chart faster than expected? Could his performance force difficult decisions later in the offseason? Could the Browns eventually face a situation where keeping him off the field becomes harder to justify? Those questions began appearing more frequently because the practice footage kept giving people reasons to ask them.
And then something happened that may have been even more significant than any throw Sanders made on the field. Some of the very people who had spent months supporting a completely different quarterback narrative suddenly started sounding less certain than before. One of the fastest ways to tell whether a player's momentum is real is to watch what happens when the media starts changing its language. Early in the offseason, much of the discussion surrounding Cleveland's quarterback situation felt predictable. The assumption was that experience would win out. The veteran options were viewed as the safest path forward, and many analysts framed the competition through that lens. Sanders was frequently mentioned as a talented young quarterback with upside, but the expectation was that his opportunity would come later rather than sooner. That narrative remained largely unchanged for months. Then the OTA practices began producing reports that were difficult to ignore, and something subtle but important started happening. The certainty that once surrounded the quarterback conversation began to disappear. What made this shift so fascinating wasn't that reporters suddenly declared Sanders the future starter. That never happened. Instead, the change appeared in smaller ways. The wording became more cautious. The confidence behind previous predictions softened. Analysts who once sounded completely convinced about the direction of the competition started acknowledging alternative possibilities. In football, those changes matter because reporters covering teams every day often have a strong sense of the internal dynamics. When they begin adjusting their tone, fans notice immediately. And in Cleveland, many people noticed exactly that. Discussions that once centered almost entirely around established veterans gradually began including Sanders as a legitimate factor in the race. One of the biggest reasons this attracted attention was because certain media figures had spent months reinforcing a different expectation. Their reporting wasn't unreasonable. After all, organizations often lean toward experience, particularly at the quarterback position. Veterans understand the system, have seen more defensive looks, and typically enter camp with an advantage. But football has always been a performance-driven business. No matter how strong a narrative becomes, it eventually collides with what happens on the field. And according to multiple reports emerging from Browns practices, Sanders was giving observers more reasons to talk about his performance than many anticipated. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer focused solely on what he might become in the future. It was becoming increasingly focused on what he was doing right now. The interesting part wasn't necessarily what reporters were saying, it was what they were no longer saying. Earlier assumptions about a clear hierarchy started giving way to more nuanced conversations. Instead of presenting the competition as virtually decided, analysts began discussing scenarios in which Sanders could continue climbing. Instead of focusing entirely on experience, they began highlighting practice performance. Instead of emphasizing developmental timelines, they started talking about progress. These may seem like minor differences, but in sports media, they often signal larger shifts in perception. The more Sanders performed, the more difficult it became for observers to ignore his impact on the conversation. Some fans interpreted these developments as proof that opinions were changing. Others viewed them as simple reactions to strong off-season performances. The truth likely falls somewhere in the middle.
Reporters respond to information, and new information was emerging almost daily. Strong practices create headlines. Accurate throws generate discussion. Positive evaluations attract attention. As a result, people who had previously focused on other storylines found themselves discussing Sanders more frequently. That alone represented a significant development because attention in the NFL is earned, not given. Quarterbacks receive endless scrutiny, but they also have to provide reasons for people to keep talking about them, and Sanders was doing exactly that. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the media shift was the timing. These changes weren't occurring during preseason games or after a regular season winning streak. They were happening during off-season practices. That tells you how impressive some observers believed his development had been. Typically, it takes months of production to reshape public opinion. In this case, practice performances alone were generating enough buzz to alter conversations that seemed settled only weeks earlier. Whether that momentum ultimately leads to a starting opportunity remains unknown, but what is clear is that the narrative surrounding Sanders no longer resembles the narrative that existed when the offseason began. And while changing opinions can be interesting, there is something even more powerful than media buzz. Eventually, every quarterback debate reaches the same destination: the numbers. Because praise can be subjective, narratives can change, and opinions can evolve. Statistics, however, force everyone to confront the same reality. At some point, every quarterback debate moves beyond opinions and enters a much less comfortable territory: the numbers. Analysts can argue about potential, fans can debate narratives, reporters can discuss what they believe they are seeing on the practice field, but statistics have a way of cutting through the noise. They don't settle every argument, but they force people to address facts they might otherwise prefer to ignore. And that is exactly why the conversation surrounding Shedeur Sanders became so difficult to dismiss. The more people examined the available results from Browns' offseason practices and organized team activities, the harder it became to pretend that his performance was merely a temporary storyline. Whether someone supported him or doubted him, the numbers demanded attention.
One of the most frequently discussed figures was his completion percentage during the media-observed practice period. Reports indicated that Sanders completed over 77% of his passes, while also producing multiple touchdown throws. On the surface, some critics immediately pushed back, arguing that off-season practices should not be treated the same as regular season games. That's a fair point. Nobody is claiming that OTA statistics automatically predict NFL success. However, what makes these numbers noteworthy is not the environment itself, but the consistency they represent. Quarterbacks compete against the same defensive looks, operate within the same practice structure, and face many of the same conditions. When one quarterback consistently performs at a high level within that environment, evaluators pay attention because they are looking for indicators of growth, command, and efficiency. The completion percentage alone would have generated discussion, but it wasn't the only statistic attracting attention. The touchdown production added another layer to the story. Successful quarterbacks are expected to move the offense, create scoring opportunities, and finish drives. Reports from practices suggested that Sanders was repeatedly finding ways to do exactly that. More importantly, the touchdown numbers appeared alongside strong efficiency metrics rather than reckless risk-taking. This distinction matters because there is a major difference between an aggressive quarterback who creates highlights while also making costly mistakes and a quarterback who combines production with precision. Supporters of Sanders argued that his off-season performances reflected the second category. The growing emphasis on accuracy and decision-making only strengthened that perception. Another statistic frequently mentioned involved turnovers, or more accurately, the lack of them. Quarterback competitions are often won or lost through decision-making. Coaches can tolerate occasional mistakes, but they become concerned when poor choices become habits. According to reports surrounding the practice sessions, Sanders avoided many of the costly errors that often derail young quarterbacks. Even discussions surrounding interceptions frequently included additional context explaining how certain plays developed. For observers looking for evidence of maturity and growth, that detail stood out. They weren't just evaluating completions and touchdowns, they were evaluating how efficiently he managed the offense as a whole. What makes the statistical discussion particularly interesting is how it compares with the expectations surrounding Sanders when he first arrived.
The prevailing belief was that he would require a significant adjustment period. That assumption wasn't unreasonable. The transition from college football to the NFL challenges even the most talented prospects. Defensive schemes become more complex, passing windows become smaller, mistakes become more expensive. Yet the numbers emerging from practices suggested that Sanders was adapting faster than many predicted. Whether that progress continues remains uncertain, but the early indicators have undeniably changed the tone of the conversation. The deeper analysts looked into the statistics, the more they found evidence supporting the observations reporters had already been sharing. The accuracy everyone was talking about wasn't just visible on highlight clips, it appeared in completion percentages. The consistency people praised wasn't just anecdotal, it showed up in repeated practice results. The confidence observers described wasn't merely a feeling, it seemed reflected in the way Sanders operated the offense and distributed the football. Gradually, separate pieces of information began reinforcing one another. The eye test supported the numbers, and the numbers supported the eye test. That's usually when a story starts gaining real momentum. Of course, statistics can never tell the entire story. Some of the most important quarterback qualities cannot be measured through percentages or touchdown totals. Leadership doesn't appear in a box score. Confidence isn't listed beside passing yards. The ability to energize teammates cannot be tracked through traditional metrics. Yet, as the debate surrounding Sanders continued to grow, many observers began arguing that his most valuable contribution might actually exist beyond the numbers that were generating headlines. And if that turns out to be true, the Browns may be dealing with a situation that is even more significant than a quarterback posting impressive offseason statistics. The most dangerous thing about Shedeur Sanders' rise in Cleveland may not be the throws, the statistics, or even the growing media attention. It may be the effect he appears to have on the people around him. Because while quarterbacks are always evaluated through measurable traits like arm strength, mobility, and decision-making, the truly rare ones often change the emotional temperature of an entire team. That quality is much harder to define, which is exactly why organizations become obsessed when they believe they have found it. And according to multiple observations coming out of Browns practices, there are growing signs that Sanders may already be influencing the atmosphere inside the building in ways that extend far beyond the stat sheet. One thing that consistently follows certain quarterbacks is energy. Teammates respond differently around them, practices feel sharper, players move with more confidence, momentum seems to build faster after successful plays. These details sound small individually, but inside professional locker rooms they matter enormously. Football seasons are long, exhausting, and emotionally draining. Teams desperately search for players capable of lifting morale during difficult stretches. Several analysts discussing Sanders have repeatedly hinted at this exact quality. They describe a quarterback who remains composed under pressure, communicates confidently, and naturally draws attention when he steps into the huddle. Those characteristics may not guarantee future greatness, but they absolutely influence how teammates respond in the present.
What makes this development especially interesting is that many supporters believe this pattern has followed Sanders throughout his football journey. Long before the NFL spotlight arrived, coaches and teammates at previous levels often spoke about his confidence and presence. Whether it was high school programs, college locker rooms, or now professional practices, the same descriptions seem to appear repeatedly. Players feed off belief, and quarterbacks who project calm confidence can stabilize an entire offense. Some observers covering the Browns have suggested that this quality may explain why discussions surrounding Sanders feel different compared to ordinary rookie hype. The excitement isn't just about talent, it's about the reaction he appears to generate from those around him. The Raiders game offered one of the clearest examples of this effect. Cleveland entered that matchup struggling through a disappointing season, and by that point, many players around the league might have mentally checked out. Losing seasons create frustration, tension, and exhaustion inside organizations. Yet when Sanders escaped pressure and launched that now famous deep strike, the emotional response from the sideline reportedly felt immediate. Big plays always energize teams, but there are certain moments that seem to shift belief entirely. For some observers, that throw represented more than a completion. It represented a spark. It created the feeling that something different might be possible whenever he was on the field. That emotional impact matters because leadership at the quarterback position is often revealed during adversity rather than success. Anyone can appear confident while winning comfortably. The real test comes when circumstances become difficult. Can a quarterback steady teammates after mistakes? Can he maintain composure when protection breaks down? Can he keep players engaged during losing stretches? Those are the questions organizations constantly ask themselves, and according to several reports and analyst discussions, Sanders has impressed people not only with his physical ability, but also with the way he carries himself throughout competition. Even while navigating intense scrutiny and non-stop public debate, he has continued projecting confidence and composure. Another factor fueling this conversation is the way teammates reportedly respond during practices. Football players notice everything. They notice which quarterbacks command attention in meetings. They notice who communicates clearly during drills. They notice who delivers catchable footballs consistently. Most importantly, they notice who gives them confidence that plays can succeed even when situations become difficult. Several discussions surrounding Browns OTAs hinted that Sanders was earning respect through repetition rather than personality alone. Every accurate throw reinforced trust. Every successful drive strengthened belief. Over time, those moments begin shaping locker room dynamics in ways outsiders often cannot fully see. Of course, leadership conversations can become exaggerated quickly, especially during the offseason. Fans naturally become excited about young quarterbacks, and speculation often grows faster than reality. Some reports praising Sanders may reflect enthusiasm more than certainty. That distinction is important because true leadership ultimately has to survive the pressure of real NFL games. Yet even with that caution in mind, the growing number of people discussing his influence inside the organization is difficult to ignore. Rarely do rookie quarterbacks generate this much conversation about both performance and presence simultaneously. Usually one arrives before the other. In Sanders' case, supporters believe both may be developing at the same time. And that creates an even larger problem for the Browns moving forward, because if a young quarterback begins producing statistically while also energizing teammates and attracting growing support inside the building, eventually the organization faces a question it may not have expected to confront this early. What happens if the locker room starts believing in him faster than the original plan anticipated? That possibility becomes especially complicated when another quarterback already sits at the center of one of the most controversial and expensive situations in the entire NFL. As impressive as Shedeur Sanders' offseason story has become, there is one obstacle standing directly between momentum and opportunity, and unlike a blitzing defender or a difficult defensive coverage, this challenge isn't happening on the field, it's happening inside the Browns organization itself. Because every conversation about Sanders eventually circles back to the same reality: Deshaun Watson. No matter how many impressive throws Sanders makes, no matter how much praise emerges from practices, and no matter how many fans begin calling for change, the Browns still have to navigate one of the most complicated quarterback situations in professional football. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Sanders isn't simply competing against other quarterbacks. In many ways, he's competing against years of organizational investment, expectations, and decisions that were made long before he arrived in Cleveland. For years, Watson was viewed as the centerpiece of the Browns' future plans. The organization invested heavily in him, believing he could elevate the franchise into consistent championship contention. When a team commits that many resources to a player, moving away from that vision becomes extremely difficult. Fair or unfair, those investments create pressure. Coaches feel it, executives feel it, ownership feels it. Reports and commentary throughout the offseason have suggested that Watson would naturally receive every opportunity to reclaim his position because of those circumstances. That perspective isn't unusual in professional sports. Organizations often prefer to exhaust every possibility before admitting that a major investment may no longer represent the best path forward.
The irony is that many of the qualities generating excitement today are the same qualities some supporters pointed to long before the draft: accuracy, poise, confidence under pressure, leadership presence, competitive toughness. None of these traits suddenly appeared during Browns practices. Advocates believed they existed all along. What has changed is the setting. NFL practices carry a different level of credibility than college projections. When observers begin reporting that those same strengths are showing up against professional competition, people naturally revisit previous evaluations. Suddenly, conversations that seemed settled on draft night become open for debate once again. For teams around the league, this is where the pressure begins. No organization wants to become the answer to a future trivia question. Nobody wants to be remembered as the team that overlooked a successful quarterback prospect. That's why player development is monitored so closely after the draft. Teams pay attention to former prospects even after they are selected elsewhere. They track progress. They compare expectations to reality. They quietly evaluate whether their original conclusions still make sense. As Sanders continues generating positive attention, it becomes increasingly likely that front offices around the league are paying close attention to every development. They may never admit it publicly, but that's how professional sports operate. What makes this story even more dramatic is the possibility that Sanders has not yet come close to reaching his ceiling. The reports attracting attention today are coming from off-season practices and limited opportunities. He is still learning the system. He is still adjusting to professional defenses. He is still developing chemistry with teammates. If his supporters are correct, then the most impressive moments may still lie ahead. That possibility is exactly why discussions about teams passing on him continue growing louder. Every promising sign creates another round of second-guessing. Every successful practice adds another layer to the debate. Every positive evaluation increases curiosity about what could happen if he eventually receives a larger opportunity. Of course, it's important to remember that none of this guarantees future success. Football history is filled with players who generated off-season excitement only to encounter challenges later. Development is rarely linear. Expectations can become inflated. Progress must eventually be proven during meaningful games. Yet the excitement surrounding Sanders persists because people aren't simply reacting to one highlight or one statistic. They are reacting to a collection of evidence that continues growing. The Raiders throw, the OTA performances, the accuracy reports, the shifting media narrative, the leadership discussions. Together, they form a picture that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And perhaps that's why this story feels larger than a typical quarterback competition. It isn't just about whether Sanders can climb the Browns' depth chart. It isn't just about whether he can earn playing time. It has become a test of football evaluation itself. Every successful step forward forces people to revisit assumptions that once felt certain. Every new report creates fresh debate about how prospects are judged and why some players fall further than expected. In many ways, Sanders has become one of the most closely watched young quarterbacks in the league, precisely because so many people are invested in discovering whether the original evaluation was right or wrong. The most intriguing part is that the answer may arrive sooner than anyone expected, because if the current trajectory continues, the Browns could soon face a decision that changes the direction of their franchise. And when that moment arrives, all the discussions, statistics, predictions, and speculation will be replaced by one simple question. Has the quarterback race already started moving in a direction that nobody saw coming? When this offseason began, the quarterback situation in Cleveland seemed relatively straightforward. Most discussions revolved around experience, established veterans, and organizational expectations. Shedeur Sanders was often viewed as a player whose biggest opportunities would come sometime in the future. The assumption was that he would spend months learning, developing, and preparing for a chance that might not arrive until much later. But football has a way of disrupting carefully crafted timelines. It has a way of creating opportunities where none appeared to exist. And over the course of the past few weeks, that's exactly what appears to have happened. Whether intentionally or not, Sanders has forced his way into a conversation that many people believed was already settled. The evidence behind that shift is difficult to ignore. It begins with the throw that continues to follow him everywhere. The deep strike against the Raiders wasn't just an impressive highlight, it became a symbol of the traits supporters have been talking about for years. Accuracy under pressure, composure when the pocket collapses, the ability to create explosive plays when situations appear broken. Then came the off-season practices, where multiple observers began describing remarkably similar things:
tight window completions, precise ball placement, consistent decision-making, reports that kept reinforcing one another until they became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Suddenly, the same strength that appeared during live game action were appearing again in front of reporters and analysts watching every practice.
This is where the debate becomes particularly intense among fans and analysts. On one side are those who believe experience should matter. They argue that a veteran quarterback with years of NFL knowledge deserves the first opportunity to lead the offense. They point to past success, familiarity with professional defenses, and the reality that young quarterbacks often require additional development. On the other side are those who believe performance should outweigh reputation. They argue that football is ultimately a merit-based business. If a younger player is consistently producing better results and generating stronger momentum, then difficult decisions may eventually become unavoidable. Neither side lacks logic, which is why the conversation continues growing louder with every passing week. Adding even more intrigue is the uncertainty surrounding what the Browns truly want. Publicly, organizations rarely reveal their intentions during quarterback competitions. Coaches typically emphasize patience, competition, and evaluation. They avoid making definitive statements because circumstances can change quickly. Injuries happen, players improve, expectations shift. As a result, much of the discussion surrounding Watson and Sanders has been driven by interpretation rather than official declarations. Some reports have suggested that Watson remains the favorite because of experience and organizational investment. Others have pointed to Sanders' strong performances as evidence that the competition may be closer than many initially believed. The reality likely exists somewhere between those positions, which only fuels additional speculation. Another factor complicating the situation is timing. If Sanders had arrived during a period of complete organizational stability, his path might have looked different. Instead, he entered a quarterback room already surrounded by scrutiny, expectations, and non-stop public debate. Every practice rep receives attention. Every positive report generates headlines. Every comparison creates new arguments. Under those circumstances, even routine off-season developments can feel much larger than they actually are. That's exactly what appears to be happening in Cleveland. Which should be a straightforward evaluation process, has evolved into one of the most closely watched storylines of the offseason. The most difficult challenge for decision-makers may involve balancing short-term expectations with long-term potential. Veterans often provide familiarity and predictability. Young quarterbacks offer upside and possibility. Organizations spend years trying to identify the right moment to transition from one to the other. Move too quickly, and you risk disrupting development. Wait too long, and you risk delaying the future. If Sanders continues progressing at his current pace, the Browns could eventually find themselves confronting that exact dilemma. It is a problem many franchises would love to have, but it remains a problem nonetheless. What's particularly interesting is that some analysts have begun suggesting that Sanders' strongest argument may not be based solely on statistics or highlight throws. Instead, they believe the real pressure comes from momentum. Momentum changes expectations. Momentum influences public opinion. Momentum forces difficult conversations that weren't happening before. The more positive reports emerge, the harder it becomes to maintain assumptions that once seemed unquestioned. That's why the quarterback battle feels different today than it did only a few months ago. The discussion is no longer about whether Sanders belongs in the conversation. It's about how large of a role he might ultimately play. And while Cleveland wrestles with those questions, there is another group watching this entire situation very closely. They're not inside the Browns facility, they're not participating in practices, but every impressive throw, every positive report, and every sign of progress forces them to revisit a decision they made not long ago. The teams that passed on Shedeur Sanders during the draft. Perhaps the most fascinating part of Shedeur Sanders' rise in Cleveland has nothing to do with the Browns at all. It involves dozens of front offices across the league that spent months evaluating him, studying his film, interviewing him, discussing him in draft rooms, and ultimately deciding to go in another direction. Every NFL draft creates stories like this. Some prospects are selected earlier than expected. Others slide much further than analysts predict.
But what makes Sanders' situation unique is the level of attention surrounding his journey. Few prospects entered the draft process with more visibility. His strengths were debated endlessly. His weaknesses were analyzed from every possible angle. Supporters believed he possessed the tools to become a franchise quarterback. Critics questioned whether certain aspects of his game would translate at the professional level. Then, draft weekend arrived, and team after team chose to pass. At the time, many believed that decision would define the narrative surrounding his career. Now, that narrative appears to be changing. Every positive report coming out of Cleveland creates the same uncomfortable question for those organizations. What if they missed something? That's the question no front office wants to face. NFL teams invest enormous resources into scouting. Entire departments exist to evaluate prospects and project future success. Coaches, executives, scouts, and analysts spend countless hours trying to identify which players can thrive at the next level. Yet despite all that preparation, mistakes still happen every year. Some prospects exceed expectations, others fail to meet them. That's the reality of talent evaluation. What makes the Sanders story compelling is that his early progress has already reignited debates about whether his draft position accurately reflected his potential.
The numbers only added more fuel to the discussion. Strong completion percentages, productive practice sessions, positive evaluations from people covering the team closely. While statistics alone never tell the whole story, they helped validate what observers believed they were seeing. The eye test and the production began pointing in the same direction. That's usually when momentum starts becoming real. And once momentum takes hold in the NFL, narratives can change far faster than anyone expects. Then there was the leadership conversation. For some analysts, this may be the most important piece of the puzzle. Quarterbacks are judged differently than every other position in football. Teams don't simply want talent, they want presence, they want confidence, they want players capable of elevating everyone around them. While opinions naturally vary, the growing number of people discussing Sanders' influence on teammates suggests that his impact may extend beyond what can be measured statistically. If those observations prove accurate over time, Cleveland may be looking at something much more significant than a promising young passer. Of course, none of this guarantees that Sanders will win the starting job tomorrow. The reality remains that experienced veterans still exist in the quarterback room. Organizational investments still matter. Coaches still have decisions to make. Development still takes time. There are challenges ahead that no offseason report can predict. That's why it would be premature to declare the competition over. Football careers are defined by what happens when the games begin, not by what happens in June. Yet, dismissing what Sanders has accomplished so far would be equally misguided. The conversation surrounding him has changed for a reason. What's truly remarkable is how quickly that transformation occurred. A player many believed would spend most of the year quietly developing is now generating some of the loudest discussions surrounding the franchise. Reporters are paying attention, analysts are debating, fans are arguing. Teams that passed on him are almost certainly monitoring every development, and with each passing week, the spotlight only grows brighter. That alone tells you how much momentum has built around his progress. The biggest question now isn't whether Shedeur Sanders belongs in the quarterback conversation. He has already answered that. The real question is how long the Browns can continue treating him like a future project if the evidence keeps piling up in the present. Because if the accuracy continues, if the production remains strong, and if the leadership qualities people keep discussing become even more apparent during training camp and preseason action, Cleveland may eventually find itself facing a decision far sooner than expected. And that's what makes this story so compelling. A few months ago, the quarterback race appeared to have a clear direction. Today, that certainty is gone. The throw against the Raiders opened the door, the OTA performances pushed it wider, the numbers strengthened the argument, the leadership discussions added another layer, and now an entire football world is watching to see what happens next. Because the Browns may not be deciding whether Shedeur Sanders has a future in Cleveland anymore. They may be deciding how much longer they can keep that future waiting. So,
What do you think? Has Shedeur Sanders already changed the quarterback race in Cleveland, or does the veteran experience still give someone else the edge when training camp begins? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from around the football world.